Green Goblin is a very iconic Spider-Man villain in every sense of the word. Like the Joker is to Batman, Spider-Man couldn't exist without his most iconic adversary. However, in the movies, he was actually gone by the end of the first one. While his son would later take up the mantle in Spider-Man 3, the original Green Goblin was done for. But what if he wasn't? What if Green Goblin was in Spider-Man 2 and 3? So at the end of Spider-Man 1, Norman Osborn decides for some reason not to use his glider to try killing Spider-Man, and instead Peter just apprehends him. Now Spider-Man of course exposes Norman as the Green Goblin, and he gets put in prison. Now ultimately, despite having the best lawyer that money can buy, the jury actually sides against Norman, and he's forced to plead insanity and is thrown into a mental institute. Now at the beginning of Spider-Man 2, we see that Harry Osborn is of course heavily troubled by all this, because it's giving him a bad reputation, and his co-workers at Oscorp are really not giving him a chance to prove himself. They all hate him and want him to get fired. And one of the new higher-ups at Oscorp is a man named Adrian Toomes, who, yes, I know he wasn't in the actual Spider-Man 2, but I thought it'd be kind of cool to set up a future villain like they did with the Lizard. You know, because he's a vulture and he's picking up the scraps of Harry Osborn's career. That, I know, terrible joke. Moving on. Now, despite all this going on, Harry actually still has high hopes to succeed with Otto Octavius, but that obviously also doesn't happen. So Harry ends up actually getting fired by unanimous vote from the board of directors, just like his father was before him. The sins of the father are very much apparent at Oscorp. Harry is really unhappy, and he gets heavily drunk at the planetarium party, where he nearly actually picks a fight with John Jameson, who he's extremely jealous of since he's with Mary Jane. But Peter is able to stop him from making an ass of himself, or more of an ass of himself anyway. So we see the next day, Harry Osborn is now moving out of Osborn Manor, because he has no way to keep a hold of the house now that he doesn't have a job at Oscorp. So now with nowhere else to go, he reluctantly decides to visit his father in the mental institute, and he has been regularly avoiding going to see him, because he's pretty pissed off at his dad, actually. Now we actually see that Norman's mental health has gotten worse in the asylum, and he switches between his personalities even more frequently. Now Harry of course updates him on what's been going on, and Norman tries to tell him it's all Spider-Man's fault. If Spider-Man hadn't arrested him, then Harry wouldn't have been fired, and he'd probably still be with Mary Jane, since MJ basically broke up with Harry because of her crush on Spider-Man. And we actually see this does get to Harry a little bit, and Norman tries to just go in for the kill when he sees that. He implies that he wants Harry to help him escape so they can kill Spider-Man together, aka Peter Parker. Now Harry of course thinks that's crazy, he doesn't believe that one bit, and he leaves. But his father's words, they do stick with him. So now Harry's been drinking more and more often, and he decides that he does want Spider-Man to die. That is a good idea. So later on when Doc Ock comes for the tritium, Harry asks him to bring him Spider-Man in exchange for the tritium, and the rest of the movie goes the same way it does. Harry still finds out that his father was right, and Spider-Man is Peter Parker, but he still lets him go to fight Doc Ock and save Mary Jane. Now at the end of Spider-Man 2, we see Harry still hallucinate about his father, who leads him to the Green Goblin lair hidden behind the mirror. And we end the movie with Harry going into the same chamber that his father used to become the Goblin, and he breaks his father out of the asylum. So now we've made it to Spider-Man 3, where the Osborns are now known fugitives of the law, and we see that Peter is very troubled by this. He feels like he could have stopped Harry from going down this path, but now he knows his family is in danger, so we see him relocating Mary Jane and Aunt May into somewhere in New York State, or maybe somewhere in New York City that's different, I don't know. I mean, I know he didn't relocate them, even though he knew that Harry Osborn was probably coming for him in the actual Spider-Man 3, but now he knows for sure that Harry and Norman are coming for him, and they know about MJ and May, so he's not taking any chances. So now we see Spider-Man go to battle with the Green Goblin and Harry, who would possibly become the Hobgoblin instead of the new Goblin in this version, and we see him getting his ass handed to him. The Goblins together are just seemingly too much for Spider-Man to handle, and when Peter asks Harry why he's doing this, Harry just says because he took his father from him, which, you know, has double meaning, and he took Mary Jane from him. And now in the end, Spider-Man loses his fight against the Goblins, and he's forced out of desperation to destroy one of their gliders, forcing them to retreat just like he did to Norman in the first movie. So now we're skipping all the key to the city bullshit, and we go right to the stuff with the Sandman instead. Peter once again loses to the Sandman, and now New York are wondering whether Spider-Man has lost his touch, whether he's really the man who should be protecting them. So now when Peter is at his lowest point, that's of course when he becomes one with the symbiote and gets the black suit. And suddenly he feels stronger than he's felt in a very long time. He feels like he could take on the entire world. So now Peter has what would normally be one of the most stressful days of his life, as he ends up having to fight both the Goblins and Sandman again, but he actually does fairly well against all of them thanks to the black suit. He actually ends up taking Green Goblin down and actually sends him back to prison, which Harry is of course furious about. Now he also has this emotional fight with Sandman where he seemingly kills him. So now the next day we see Peter is extremely cocky, since he just fought 3 villains the night before and came out pretty much unscathed. Now he does his evil dance, and he gets Eddie Brock fired for faking his photo just like he did, but here's a major change. He doesn't go out with Gwen Stacy, because remember, he and MJ are still together. She's just tucked away from all the action, so they don't go through the relationship drama at all. They're still together. Things are going pretty good for Peter, actually. That is until Harry makes his comeback. So now Peter has another big fight with Harry under the influence of the black suit, and during their fight, we see Peter still throw the grenade back at Harry, but because of different circumstances, this actually kills Harry. Now, I know this is very controversial, but I am sorry, I need to find a new way for Peter to get rid of the black suit, since MJ is not in New York right now. So instead of him hitting Mary Jane, he kills Harry Osborn, his best friend. He didn't mean to, but he did. So now Norman Osborn sees the report that his son is dead on the news, and needless to say, he's pretty damn pissed off about it. He wants Spider-Man's fucking head. So we actually see Norman manages to escape from prison, either from connections he built up on the inside, or this is an idea I thought of, that maybe Norman could have broken out all along, but he waited for Harry to do it, just to prove his commitment, or something like that. And meanwhile, Peter is of course horrified at what he's done, and he tries calling Mary Jane to talk about what happened, but she saw it on the news. And in that moment, she decides not to answer him. And that makes Peter feel even worse. So he goes up to the church tower, and Norman Osborn meanwhile manages to take back his Green Goblin stuff at the prison, and now he's gliding over New York, looking for the man who murdered his son. Now Peter manages to rip the symbiote off, which drips down below, but not on Eddie Brock, no. The Green Goblin himself. Because honestly, Eddie Brock still has Gwen Stacy in this timeline, so I don't think he'd be at the church in this version praying for Peter's death. So instead it passes on to Norman Osborn, whose already damaged psyche is now at an all-time low. So now we see him meeting up with the Sandman, and they agree to work together, just as Sandman and Venom did in the actual movie. So now Peter goes home and cleans up, but before he has time to settle down, he gets a phone call from Mary Jane. But when he answers, he hears that familiar cackling of the Green Goblin. He asks Spider-Man once again if he can come out to play. He asks Norman where the hell they are, and Norman tells him to go back to where he murdered his son, aka Osborn Manor. We then get an epic final showdown between Spider-Man, Sandman, and the Green Goblin at Osborn Manor, which of course ends up being destroyed. But Peter is actually able to rescue May and MJ during the chaos, and even tricks Goblin into launching pumpkin bombs at Sandman by accident. In the end, though, Norman, who lies defeated, he tries to, use this fatherly bond that he supposedly has with Peter to try and sucker him in so he can do what he actually tried to do in Spider-Man 1, which is, use the glider to kill him from behind. However, just like in Spider-Man 1, Peter dodges the blade, and it stabs Norman to death. Now, Peter, of course, removes his mask, and before he dies, he tells him he regrets everything that's led him up to this point. He didn't want any of this to happen, and he asks, for forgiveness. And Norman just says, "You want forgiveness? Get religion." Before dying. Yes, in his final moments, he refuses to forgive Peter for killing Harry, even if it was by accident. Because, I just don't think that's something that anybody could really truly move on from, especially not Norman Osborn. So now we see Sandman morph into Flint Marko, and he tells Peter what happened that night with Uncle Ben. And Peter does what Norman Osborn understandably couldn't do, and he forgives Flint Marko. And we then see in the last scenes of the movie, Aunt May, who now knows for sure Peter's Spider-Man, well, she gives him the confidence he needs to keep going on as Spider-Man after making this huge mistake in his life. And we see that he and MJ, well, they're still going strong. They might have some issues, but for now, they're going to be happy. And so that is what if the Green Goblin was in Spider-Man 2 and Spider-Man 3. So yes, you guys would probably have noticed this. You're probably wondering, like, Rinzler, you've already done this video, haven't you? Sort of. I made another video not too long ago called What If Green Goblin Didn't Die in Spider-Man 2002. And I actually liked that video. I thought I did a good job on it, not to give myself too much credit. And it seems like the majority of you liked it. But one of my longtime fans, SR Striker, he said that he was a little disappointed that I wasn't, using the Goblin, because in that video, spoiler alert if you haven't seen it yet, watch it if you want to see it before I say this, if that makes sense. Basically, in that video, I had it so that Norman Osborn actually spends the rest of the trilogy in the mental hospital. He doesn't get out ever. He doesn't do anything else as the Green Goblin. And SR Striker was disappointed about that, and honestly, I'm not surprised, because I get it, I looked back and I realized why he would be disappointed, and I understand. Like, if any of you guys were disappointed by that decision, then please let me know, because, like, I'll totally understand. It would be like, it'd be like defeating the Joker in the first Batman movie and then never doing anything with him again. Oh wait, they did that in the Tim Burton one. Okay. But either way, I understand why they did it the way they did it. I like the fact, actually, that they killed Norman. I thought it was kind of the driving force of the trilogy, even if they kind of fumbled on the last hurdle, unfortunately. Not through any fault of Sam Raimi's. That was absolutely Sony's fault that movie was bad. But as far as this scenario goes, I wanted to change that. I wanted to basically do a version 2 of the Green Goblin Doesn't Die video. And I came up with this idea where, he breaks out of jail, fights alongside his son, and, I had this idea where maybe he becomes, Venom. That was just an idea I had, because honestly, I always hated Eddie Brock being Venom in this movie. Like, I know Eddie Brock is always Venom, but, like, he's not very interesting as a character, honestly. He's not a threatening presence. Like, if they had built Eddie Brock up for 3 movies, like, remember in Spider-Man 1, they say, like, oh, Eddie's been off for weeks, so we can't even catch a glimpse of Spider-Man. Like, if that had been Eddie Brock, like, if they had built up Eddie Brock throughout the entire trilogy before he was Venom, that would have been really cool. But they didn't do that, because Sam Raimi didn't want to use Venom. So, and I just think it was too late for it to be Eddie Brock, which is why in, like, every what-if scenario I do for Spider-Man, I always have it be somebody else. Like, I always have it be, like, Harry Osborn, and at one point I had it be the Punisher, and now I'm having it be the Green Goblin. Like, I'm sorry, like, I like Topher Grace. I don't think he's that bad in the movie. He's just not built up enough. And honestly, I think the idea of Norman being, like, only further corrupted, by the symbiote, and he's already in a bad way, but being further corrupted, that would make for a really interesting story, especially if he has to also grieve the loss of his son. And honestly, I know some people are going to complain about Norman not forgiving Peter, but honestly, it's realistic. I don't think Norman would forgive Peter for that, even in his dying breaths. Because, yeah, I mean, accident or not, Peter did kill Harry, Well, at least in my version. And speaking of that, I know that killing Harry is going to be a real bummer, and I'm really hoping that I don't get disliked for that. But, like, Mary Jane in this version's not around. Like, she's not doing the whole relationship drama with Peter. She doesn't get fired from her play. None of that happens. She doesn't have her kitchen dance and kiss with Harry. None of that happens, okay? Harry doesn't get amnesia. It's a very different movie. So I had to find a different way for Peter to regret, using the symbiote. And the best way I could think of, besides hitting Mary Jane, was, for him to kill somebody by mistake. And, I thought about being the Green Goblin, but then I thought that would be just a little anticlimactic. I thought that there was more of a built-in connection, honestly, between Peter and Green Goblin, or there would have been by this point in the trilogy, because, he was his first villain, so I know he had built-in connection with Harry, don't get me wrong, but honestly, I think that his connection with Norman Osborn throughout the trilogy would have possibly been stronger, especially since Norman wasn't dead, so there's not that driving force, and now Harry's basically only trying to kill Peter out of jealousy rather than revenge. So I honestly think that Green Goblin being the survivor of the two Osborns would have made more, sense narratively. So forgive me if some of you guys hate on me for killing Harry instead of Norman. Forgive me for that. It's just, it's the only thing that really made sense to me. I mean, by all means, if you guys have a different way that he could have, done something despicable that he would regret, then feel free. But like, I just didn't think that killing a random criminal would do it, because he thought he killed the Sandman and he didn't have any remorse over it at all. And I know that's because the Sandman was personal, but that kind of, shows me that unless he accidentally kills somebody that means something really to him, he's probably not going to regret it that much. At least not while under the influence of the symbiote, of course. So either way, that is my what if Green Goblin was in Spider-Man 2 and Spider-Man 3. Let me know in the comments down below how much you love or hate it. I hope you love it, but if you hate it, then feel free to lay it on me. I want to learn from mistakes. But if you also liked it, make sure to give it a thumbs up. That also helps. Make sure to give me more what if recommendations in the comments down below about Spider-Man, Marvel, or whatever else you can think of. And I'll see all of you in the next video.